Starting in the 1300s, the old way of seeing and doing things that had characterized life in medieval Europe gradually started to give way to the splendid new vision of the Renaissance. And although the Renaissance was inspired by the ancient cultures of Greece and Rome, it was soon transformed into an age of experimentation, exploration, and innovation. So that by the time the Renaissance ended around 1650, a number of important and long-lasting changes had occurred. For example, a much more accurate understanding of the solar system had been achieved, thanks to the invention of the telescope, while the invention of the compound microscope in 1590 had allowed people a first glimpse into a hidden world they had never known existed. Improvements in shipbuilding and navigation had resulted in the discovery of 3 new continents previously unknown to Europeans. A new method for printing books had helped information and ideas rapidly spread. A movement of religious reform had resulted in the creation of the first Protestant faiths. And even the old medieval appearance of towns and cities had changed due to the incorporation of new Renaissance styles in architecture. Looking at architecture is an excellent way to improve one's understanding of the past, because historical buildings provide valuable information about how people lived and interacted with one another a long time ago. The changes that occurred in architecture between the medieval era and the Renaissance are a good example of this. During medieval times, towering churches and enormous castles were constructed all across Europe and remain as lasting monuments to the medieval way of life. Castles like this one were nothing more than the fortress homes of Europe's most powerful citizens. Most castles were built along similar lines, characterized by high stone walls and towers. And since they were constructed mostly for defense, they were not very comfortable places in which to live. However, during the Renaissance, the nobility shifted away from fortifying their homes. Some even remodeled their old medieval-style castles into places of great beauty, comfort, and elegance. This fine chateau in France contains some good examples of the kinds of changes that Renaissance architects liked to make. In this case, the high outer walls of the original castle have been removed, and a huge new house has been built around the one remaining medieval tower. The old medieval moat that once served to protect the castle has been changed into a decorative waterway, and the entire building has been surrounded by extremely colorful gardens, in which shrubs have been trimmed and plantings arranged to create beautiful geometric patterns. Renaissance architects loved light, and so the buildings they designed usually had lots of large windows that provided illumination for the big, comfortably furnished rooms inside. In addition, just like the palaces of ancient Rome, fine Renaissance houses were almost always adorned with statues of ancient gods and goddesses that would have been quite out of place in medieval castles. The changes that took place in religious buildings are quite interesting as well. In medieval times, churches were built in the Gothic style seen here, a style that employed heavy ornamentation with elaborate carvings of demons, angels, and saints. But during the Renaissance, church architects tried to give their buildings a brighter, warmer appearance, as they did so beautifully here in the great cathedral in Florence, Italy. Most Renaissance churches were much brighter and warmer feeling on the inside, too, due to the fact that architects shifted away from the use of the overwhelming amounts of stained glass favored during medieval times. Besides the amazing changes that took place in architecture during the Renaissance, a scientific revolution began to take place, too. In particular, the revolution in the science of astronomy played an important role during the Renaissance because it radically changed people's understanding of the Earth's place in the universe. Medieval people believed that the Earth never moved, and that it was at the center of the universe, ringed first by the moon and planets, then the stars, and beyond that, heaven, the dwelling place of God. And this was the official version promoted by the Catholic Church as well. During the Middle Ages, the pursuit of scientific knowledge was mostly guided by religious teachings and mysticism, rather than by careful observation. But in the early 1500s, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus, considered to be the father of modern astronomy, theorized, but could not actually prove, that the Earth made an orbit around the sun every year and also spun around on its axis once a day. In 1610, an Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei used the newly invented telescope to study the motion of the planets, and he was able to clearly demonstrate that Copernicus's theory was correct. However, because Galileo's work also proved that the Earth moved and was not at the center of the universe, it contradicted the official teachings of the Catholic Church. As a result, church officials forced him to publicly declare that his conclusions were false, and they placed him under house arrest for the remainder of his life. Nevertheless, Galileo's theories were soon verified by other Renaissance astronomers and are still the accepted view of our solar system today. The rapid growth of learning that occurred during the Renaissance was made possible by the availability of large numbers of inexpensive books. In medieval times, books like the one seen here were painstakingly copied by hand, a page at a time, usually by Catholic monks living in monasteries. Almost all books were written in Latin, the language of ancient Rome, and of the Roman Catholic Church, a tongue that was no longer spoken. In medieval times, books were quite rare, and not something likely to be found in an ordinary person's home. However, in Germany around 1450, a man named Johannes Gutenberg came up with a clever way of avoiding the tedious process of hand copying. He developed a technique for making movable type, special metal letters used for printing that could be rearranged as desired in order to create words and sentences. Printers stored movable type letters of many different sizes and styles in well-organized type cases like these. Letters from the uppercase and the lowercase were arranged or typeset into sentences for each page. Then, on a printing press like this one, ink was applied and the page was printed out. Gutenberg's speedy new method made the hand copying of books unnecessary. By 1500, movable type was being used by printers all across Europe, and they were producing new books by the tens of thousands, mostly in regional languages, instead of just in Latin. Having mass-produced books meant that the latest works of literature and science could reach people rapidly compared to the days of hand copying. And because books became more affordable, a much larger number of people began to learn how to read and write as well. One of the most important Renaissance figures to see his ideas spread by mass-produced books was a German priest and professor named Martin Luther. Luther was the leader of the Reformation, a religious movement that led to the birth of Protestantism. In the early 1500s, Luther had become increasingly concerned about what he believed were corrupt practices in the Catholic Church, practices that he thought went against biblical teaching. In 1517, he posted his thoughts, called the 95 Theses, to the door of a church here in the town of Wittenberg, Germany, for all to read. In this document, Luther particularly questioned the church's practice of selling indulgences. These were special pardons for the church's punishments for committing sins that sometimes were granted for a cash payment. Luther also made known his belief that popes and church councils could, and often did, make mistakes in religious matters. Luther asked for reform, but he was excommunicated or banned from the Catholic Church instead. In this great cathedral in the city of Worms, Germany, Luther was brought before a group of clergymen and nobles. He was ordered to withdraw his proposals for reform. Luther refused to do so and ended up going his own way. Many people believed that Luther had been correct, and they began to follow his teachings. Soon the first Protestant denominations of Christianity, such as Lutheranism and Calvinism, began to form. The Protestants refused to accept the Pope as their leader. They discarded many Catholic beliefs, focused on biblical teachings, and on the development of a more personal relationship with God. The Protestant movement was subjected to brutal repression in certain nations throughout the later part of the Renaissance. It led to immigration and was a major factor in several wars. In 1419, a century before Martin Luther touched off the Protestant Reformation in Germany, an unprecedented program of world exploration had begun far to the south in Portugal. The Portuguese wanted to obtain African gold, salt, and ivory, and find a sea route to Asia so they could control the rich trade in spices, silks, jewels, and other goods that the Asian kingdoms produced. To accomplish these goals, Prince Henry of Portugal established a school for navigation in his kingdom, near the southwestern tip of the European continent. Here he gathered together the finest geographers, astronomers, mathematicians, mapmakers, and sailors that he could find. They collected information about the tides, ocean currents, the winds, and the stars. And they used a new kind of small, sturdy ship to explore the west coast of Africa, hoping to find a sea route to India. Before he died in 1460, Prince Henry the Navigator had sent out over 50 expeditions to explore the world. But it wasn't until 1498 that a Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama finally reached India. By then, another explorer named Christopher Columbus, who sailed under the flag of Spain, was busy preparing to make a third voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. On his first voyage west in 1492, Columbus thought he had landed in India. Instead, he had actually discovered an entire new world, the continents of North and South America, that were unknown to Europeans at that time. And it was through their quest for trade and wealth that European explorers like Columbus established colonies in many far-flung lands and ended up spreading Renaissance culture, religious ideas, and inventions around the world. True or false? Copernicus and Galileo believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe. True or false? Martin Luther wanted to reform Europe's Protestant churches. True or false? Movable type printing was invented in Germany. True or false? Stained glass windows were more popular in the churches of the Middle Ages than those of the Renaissance. True or false? Spain carried out the first major explorations of the world.